He had spent fortunes on experts, on machines with blinking lights and titles nobody in the house could pronounce. He had flown doctors in from other cities, commissioned panels, paid for tests that drew ink-black reports and polite headshakes. Money bent to every resource he could imagine, except the one thing that sits quietly in plain sight: a woman's attention. Clarice arrived at the gate with a suitcase that had seen better years, and a heart that had learned to notice what others passed by. The mansion swallowed her at first. A low wall of polished stone, a fountain that tinkled like a clock, and a driveway so wide a car could turn 3 times and still have room to spare. Inside, marble met silence. Portraits looked down. An expensive light bounced off expensive floors. It would have been an alien world, if not for the things she knew how to read. Where the milk goes stale fastest, how the youngest child tucks their blanket beneath an ankle, how people organize fear. He was Fernando Almeida, a man whose name had appeared in magazines, with headlines about companies and trophies and deals. But when the household door closed behind him, he was only a father with 2 pale boys and a hole in his chest the size of an unanswered question. He had drained his savings. He had given doctors every tool they requested, and then some. The specialists had offered patience, tests, scans, an orchestra of professional empathy that never quite reached a diagnosis. The twins, Miguel and Rafael, both 5, woke in the same bed most mornings, but not as they had the day before. Miguel especially had been slipping into a world where his body would not keep up with his small ambitions. Clarice had not expected to be hired. She had sent a simple letter, short, practical, saying she could cook, she could soothe a fever. She knew how to read the face of a child when the face didn't want to tell you anything. She had been a caregiver for years. She had worked nights in wards where disinfectants sang in your clothes and the linens smelled of bleach and hospital coffee. She had left that world because she wanted to care somewhere less about alarms and more about stories. She hadn't come to this mansion to make headlines. She came because a place needed hands that noticed. The first morning Clarice stepped into the twins' room, she felt the quiet close around her. 2 beds, small cars on the floor, posters with friendly animals half-peeled at the corners. The boys' breathing hummed the same way the air conditioning hummed, mechanical and steady and false. Raphael smiled at her with the stubborn curiosity of a child who will insist on wonder despite it all. Miguel watched the ceiling, like something behind his eyes had lost its map. "Mr. Almeida hopes you can help," Donna Elsa said formally, airing her gloves as though presentation might protect her. Donna Elsa had run this house for years, part manager, part moral compass, part wall. She wore her authority like a well-pressed uniform. She had the kind of stare that straightened staff and bowed to no one. When she met Clarice, there was a look of assessment. Who was this woman with the worn suitcase? Where would she fit in the household ledger of virtues and liabilities? Clarice answered with a small, honest smile. She did not dress for a battlefield, and she had no illusions about power. She had only a steady gaze and a bag of small competencies. Fernando met Clarice in the library, where he kept his exhaustion in the left-hand cupboard and his hopes in a glass bowl. He was younger than she expected, and older than his newspapers advertised. His hands calloused from years at a desk, his eyes rimmed. He had lost the air of entitlement somewhere between specialists' offices and the twins' dim mornings. He told her plainly that he had spent whatever was necessary, that he could not remember the last time he had slept through a night, that he would pay well for someone who could simply keep watch. He did not say, "No one has found why." He did not have to. Clarice learned fast the hum of the house. The windows in the nursery were shut from the inside, heavy curtains drawn against the sun. Air conditioning kept a constant breath in the rooms. Doors seemed to remain closed with a purpose. She noticed in small, accumulating ways a pattern that did not sit right. The boys were worse in the mornings, listless, with small lips drained of color. By mid-afternoon, they could rally for a walk in the garden. Pebbles and sunlight, and the sound of someone trimming hedges might bring a laugh. Outside the house, they were children again. Inside, they were a riddle. It began with tiny things. Miguel would cough at dawn, a dry, stubborn cough that had nothing to do with the cold. Raphael's eyes would water when he was carried across the hallway. One evening, Clarice stood at the nursery door and realized the boys were quieter when the maid polished the toys. The maid moved from shelf to shelf with a ritual of sprays and rags. She used a product from a blue bottle with a utilitarian label, speaking the brand like a prayer, because cleanliness in the house's ledger meant protection. Clarice watched as the maid wiped down a plastic train set and then leaned to check her own hands for the faint chemical scent clinging to her nails. At night, Clarice sat on the nursery floor and read from a storybook she carried. She read because the boys needed the ordinary cadence of sentences, and because in those low, made-up voices she could see who they had been before sickness rearranged their days. She learned Miguel liked the page about the moon, and that Raphael always wanted the same line repeated, "And the fox said." The repetition gave them a small certainty. They could hold those words even when their bodies could not be trusted to hold a toy. Clarice found a rhythm. Make breakfast at 7, report to Mr. Almeida, check the cupboards, monitor breathing. The routine kept the anxiety from unspooling. She did what caregivers do. She kept records, not in any official ledger. A tattered notebook now lived in the suitcase, pages filled with notes about when the boys ate, when their coughs thickened, when Raphael's smile came back for a while. It was a private thing, an accumulation of data done by someone who had learned the value of noticing. People laughed sometimes, workers in the house who believed that such notes belonged to fretful mothers or obsessive nurses. But Clarice's notebook had saved more than one child in her past posts. Patterns do not exist for the comfort of paperwork alone. They exist to point away from coincidence and toward cause. When she took the twins outside, they improved. Sunlight seemed to lift their hollows, wind teased the hairs on their arms, and suddenly the house felt like a glass bell jar that had muted life itself. Miguel would reach for dandelions, Raphael would run with a squeal. Fernando watched them sometimes with that look of complex gratitude and fear that fills parents who think their children might be slipping away. On one afternoon, after the boys had spent an hour playing under the fig tree, Clarice saw Fernando standing by the gate, his hands in his pockets, staring at the place where the lawn met the road. The man with millions felt like a man with nothing at that moment. He'd been told again and again to be patient. The doctors had said it might be neurological, it might be allergic. It might be simply a mystery that time would untangle. They had offered intravenous drips, pulses of steroids, therapies that rearranged schedules and tempers. The bills came attached to medical jargon and apologies. "She notices things other people don't," Donna Elsa said once, in a tone that was equal parts warning and intrigue. She had watched Clarice chart the boys' days. Donna Elsa had her own secrets. She had been in the house for decades and had seen staff come and go, each with different theories about the twins' condition. She had seen husbands with shiny belts and tired eyes learn to carry grief as if it were another household chore. Donna Elsa respected Clarice's quiet work because it was not flashy, it was thorough. That respect, at first quiet, would prove pivotal. The chief specialist in town was Dr. Ottavio. He had the sort of medical certainty that comes from years behind a podium and a bookshelf, heavy with academic endorsements. He was the kind of man who wore trim suits and precise disapproval. His opinion carried weight. He commanded a room with a tone that made others unconsciously lower their notes and defer. He visited the twins in a white coat that spoke of institutional training and a specialized eye that scanned medical possibility like a hawk. He listened to samples, examined reflexes, read scans. He had offered diagnoses that ranged on the map from consult to conclusive and then sometimes retreated. correcting his previous certainty as new test results arrived. Clarice met him only once in those first weeks. She had waited outside his office while he spoke and gestured and turned his diagnosis like a coin under light. When she finally stood before him, she felt the strain of every person who had ever tried to speak up and been ignored. She offered the small notes she kept, carefully explained the morning worse, afternoon better pattern, and asked if they might consider environmental causes. That word, environmental, felt like a key she had no right to use in a room that smelled of antiseptic and authority. Dr. Ottavio listened. He nodded in all the places that politeness required, and then, with a thin smile, he folded his hands and supplied the professional dismissal. "It's not impossible," he said, "but improbable. In homes like this, we must first consider genetic possibilities, rare metabolic disorders, neurodevelopmental syndromes. The tests for those are expensive, but they will be decisive." He used words that sounded final. He suggested more scans, more panels. He spoke gently of parental anxiety and the need to avoid chasing shadows. Clarice felt something like heat in her chest. Neither anger nor humiliation, only a familiar resolve. She knew what it was to be overlooked. She had been overlooked for her accent, her uniform, the fact that her passport of experience did not come stamped by an ivory tower. But she had learned to listen to other authorities, the small clues that make up a body's story. In the basement of the house, Clarice found the first real contradiction. She went down there to fetch extra blankets. The basement smelled of cold cement and faint floral polish. Shelves ran along one wall, industrial canisters lined up in precise rows. Someone in the house ran a regimen of cleaning that was more antiseptic than domestic. Bottles of powders and liquids stood like soldiers. One blue bottle, larger than the rest, had a printed label and a name she recognized from the hospitals where she had worked cleaning after surgeries. The letters were clinical: glutaraldehyde. Clarice had known the name in passing, the way one knows a neighbor's reputation by overheard conversations. In wards where people had been sterilized with thoroughness, the staff had handled glutaraldehyde with gloves and ventilation, and they had always been spoken of with a muted caution. Effective, corrosive, if mishandled, used in industrial-scale sterilization. Someone had ordered a quantity of it, enough to suggest regular use throughout the house. The blue bottle was not meant for toy surfaces or children's faces. It belonged in autoclaves and labs. It hung in the in-between where household luxury met commercial hygiene. Clarice stood still, the bottle a small, bright confession. She had learned to read labels as other people read faces. Words like industrial and sterilizing had a cost when they came into contact with a child's unprotected lungs. She did not know the clinical specifics well enough to fashion a diagnosis. That was not her role, but she had a thing called caution that had been forged through years of paying attention, and the pattern she had been tracking clicked into a new shape with the bottle's presence. She did not move the bottle. Instead, she took a photograph on the cheap cell phone she kept for bus tickets and emergency numbers. She wrote a note in her tattered notebook. Basement, blue bottle, glutaraldehyde. Used often? Ask. She folded the paper and put it back in the suitcase. Whatever this was, it was now a piece of record. The next steps tested patience. Clarice approached Fernando with the finding. He leaned back in his leather chair and took the phone from her hand. He read the printout of the bottle's label and held the phone as if it might burn. In his face, Clarice could see the two men he had been until now, the industrialist who bought silence, and the father who would bargain with the whole world for one normal day. He rubbed his forehead. "We paid for clean," he said, more to himself than to her. "We paid for people who keep everything sterile." "A sterilant," Clarice said gently. She did not want to frighten him, only to invite him to see. "It's for equipment. In the hospital we never used it near children. It's strong." "Strong how?" he asked, the question hanging between desire and dread. Not a medical verdict, not yet. Clarice offered the only evidence she had that would hold in a room that prized charts, the pattern, the bottle, the way the boys brightened outside. "I noticed they get better in the garden," she said, "and worse in the mornings. The windows are always closed, the cleaning is heavy." She told him about the blue bottle. She told him she had seen people exposed before, workers whose eyes stung, who coughed after the cleaners came in. But she did not make claims that would lie outside her remit. She offered questions instead. Fernando put the phone down. For a moment, he seemed to take counsel from 100 consultations stacked in his head. Then he said quietly, "Call Dr. Ottavio. See what he thinks." Clarice did. The reply was what she feared, a careful, clinical dismissal. "Environmental causes are possible," the doctor's secretary said, parroting the safe language of hospitals, "but they are not the most likely. Dr. Ottavio recommends continuing the tests he has already ordered. Please do not alarm yourself." The tone at the other end of the line was kind, in the way of people trained to be kind without being vulnerable. The house continued its rituals. Machines hummed. A cleaner came during the night with a cart of sprays. Clarice began to time the events. The boys' mornings grew worse in little, measurable steps. More listless, more coughing when they woke, small headaches they could not explain past the thin mouths of their questions. Clarice tried to keep the household calm, but tension climbed like ivy. Donna Elsa watched the notebook with a new look. Less suspicion now, more something like alliance. If Clarice's concern was right, then these were not accidents, but a failing system wearing silk. Yet the architecture of authority is not easily toppled. Dr. Ottavio, in the privacy of his office, explained the likelihood that a household would use hospital-grade sterilant improperly as small. Statistical improbabilities find sympathy in institutions. They also have a knack for protecting reputations. He suggested more tests, genetic panels, metabolic screenings, a regimen of therapies to stabilize symptoms. He believed in the slow, careful machinery of medicine. He had no appetite for theatrical solutions scraped from basements. To him, a blue bottle was a mundane footnote until proven otherwise. On a late afternoon, Clarice sat in the study with Fernando and unfolded the notebook again. She placed the photograph of the bottle between 2 pages, like a pressed flower, and asked for a different test, one that would look for chemical exposure. She suggested, without fanfare, a toxicology panel. The word itself moved in the room. It sounded specific, responsible. It sounded like a truce between fear and procedure. Fernando hesitated. There was a cost, money and dignity, but the price was only the least of the things he was paying. "Doctor said it's not likely," he murmured, the phrase a small surrender. "He thinks we are chasing shadows." "Sometimes the shadow is the thing," Clarice replied, her voice even. "Sometimes the thing you need to look for sits where no one expects it to, under a stair in a basement shelf. I don't know, but we can ask the hospital to look. If it's nothing, then we have tests and we stop worrying. If it's something, we might have answers." There is always a moment in stories like this where money can speed things or stall them. Fernando had both the inclination to trust the man he had hired to diagnose and the hard, impatient love that would test any assumption. He made a fragile decision. He called the hospital and asked for the toxicology. The hospital asked for a formal referral. Dr. Ottavio discussed it and circled back to his probabilities. He was not hostile, but his tone contained the professional patience of someone who had seen panic pin itself to insignificant things. Donna Elsa stood at the edge of these discussions like someone balancing a candlestick. She had her duties. She had also watched how the household's actions affected its people. She had a loyalty to the family, and yet the family was not yet hers to protect entirely. She worried about reputations, about rumors that might slip through the staff, but she also worried about the boys. Her gloves had never been a shield against conscience. She began to move differently in the house, less in rigid steps, more in small, secret care. She would leave windows slightly ajar at dawn when she thought nobody watched. Small rebellions take the shape of cracked seals and opened curtains. Clarice's insistence made waves. The staff whispered that a maid with a suitcase could not upend the decisions of men with diplomas. The household's other workers shifted in the margins. Some smiled encouragement, others shook their heads. But a strange thing happened in the weeks that followed. The family started to listen to the pattern again, hard enough to be frightened by it. The boys were, for once, the axis around which adults revolved. Their small faces redirected the machinery of concern from professional pride to parental desperation. One night, after the twins had finally fallen into the kind of sleep that dreams use, like a soft blanket, Clarice sat by their bed and watched the slow rise and fall of their chests. The mansion breathed its own clean-scented breath. Outside, the garden rustled like a language. Inside, Clarice felt the old, steady flame of obligation. She had no title, no certificate on a wall that she could point to, only a careful eye and the courage to point. She thought about all the times she'd been told nothing could be done. She thought of her mother, who had died because doors had been closed where a question should have been asked. Memory can be a teacher more insistent than textbooks. Clarice wrote in her notebook the small things she had seen that day and added one line at the bottom: push for toxicology. She put the notebook back into the suitcase and lay awake, with the sound of the house like a held breath. The morning Clarice found the blue bottle on the bottom shelf of the basement, it was raining. Water carved new patterns in the fountain, and the world outside the gates had been reduced to a wash of reflections. She carried the photograph like a small prayer to the kitchen, where Donna Elsa ironed linens. They stood across from each other, two women used to small acts having large consequences. "You know what that is, don't you?" Donna Elsa asked. Not unkindly. Clarice nodded. "It belongs in hospital sterilizing units," she said, "not where children play." Donna Elsa's hands clipped the cloth on the board with a soft finality. "We have always cleaned the house the way the owners expect. Orders came from—" She stopped, because some histories in the house were better left unsaid. "It may be nothing," she said. And in those words she included the weight of houses, of proprietors, of reputations. But in the same breath she added, with a small, clear voice, "Or it may be something. The boys deserve to have us check." The house had not seen such a shift in months. Decisions that had been made on schedule were being pushed open by a woman with a modest suitcase and the habit of watching. It was the kind of disruption power does not welcome, but sometimes needs. Clarice sat across from Fernando in the study again, this time with the notebook open and the photograph on the table like a new piece of evidence. He read, silent, then looked up as if the words had been a map and he was now at a fork. "If we test, and it's nothing," he said slowly, "we have wasted money on a test. If we don't, and it's something, then we will have wasted more than money," Clarice cut in, because she knew the cost such things could take. She did not mean to be harsh, she meant to be clear. He closed his eyes and let a breath go. "Do it," he said. "Do the toxicology." For one bright hour, the world slowed into an efficient tunnel. The hospital agreed to collect samples. Nurses spoke in a tone that implied cooperation rather than condescension. Dr. Ottavio, when he heard about the request, did not oppose it outright. His face, the morning he paused in the hallway, showed a curiosity with an edge of guardedness. "If there is something in the environment," he said to Fernando, "we will find it. If not, we will close one more door." He did not say it was likely. That was his shield and his oath. Clarice felt light in a way she could not have predicted. The request for tests was not a victory. Tests could say nothing, but they could also say something decisive. She had spent years learning to think like an observer, to translate patterns into questions. Now those questions were going to be recorded by professionals whose tools could translate intuition into proof. Days moved with a careful tension. The twins were taken in for blood and urine samples. They handled needles with a bravado that made Clarice laugh and cry at the same time. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and human patience. A technician took the samples and labeled them with the precise printhouses of procedure. They would be sent to a lab that handled toxicology with the gravity of an accountant checking ledgers. Clarice kept a small distance in those moments. She knew the limits of her role. She had pushed for a doorway. She had asked for a formal way to enter a problem that had been living like a secret in the house. There was a hush in the house after the samples were taken, a waiting that made every tick of a clock count. Fernando hovered, a man who had never been as small as he felt then. Dr. Ottavio continued his rounds elsewhere in the hospital, his professional distance maintained. Donna Elsa moved through the house like a woman carrying the future in a tray, careful, balanced, present. Clarice kept observing. She watched the windows, she watched the cleaners, she watched the boys who played with a slow joy that betrayed no knowledge of tests. She learned to find solace in small things, a brush of hair behind Miguel's ear, Raphael's pleased discovery of a ladybug. Families are built of such moments, little acts of repair that have nothing to do with the economics of medicine. Then one afternoon, when the light leaned in through the curtains at a certain angle and the house smelled faintly of lemon and rain, Deloitte, an outside maid, cleaned the boys' toys with the blue bottle. Clarice stood frozen, not because she was afraid to confront, but because she wanted to hold the moment in its full, terrible clarity. Every habit in the room led away from these bottles' original purpose. The maid sprayed the toys, while Raphael sat on the floor and reached for a truck, his face trusting and unknowing. Clarice stepped forward. She spoke first to the maid, in a voice that was not angry but ordered. "Stop," she said. "Do not use that on the toys." The maid blinked, accustomed to being told what to do by those above her in the hierarchy of a household. "But they clean," she protested. "The lady wants everything clean." "Clean is not the same as safe," Clarice said. "We have asked the hospital to check for chemicals. Until we know, use warm water and soap. Do not use sprays like that around the children." The maid's face hardened with a small rebellion, as if Clarice had asked her to break a protocol that kept her employed. "Who are you to tell me that?" she shot back. Clarice did not answer with titles. She answered with the language of care. "I am someone who is keeping them alive," she said. The sentence hung like a small bell. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of agency. Word travels in houses like drafts. The cleaning staff began to whisper among themselves. A few complied, dutifully switching to plain soap. Others smirked. Yet the blue bottle remained on its shelf in the basement, an obstinate fact. When the first results arrived, the house held its breath. Clarice read the short, clinical letter that came through the hospital's online portal, while Fernando watched over her shoulder. The lab had reported a preliminary finding. Substances consistent with exposure had been detected and required further analysis. The wording was cautious. It had to be. The lab did not leap to conclusions. It offered instead a technical observation and suggested next steps, confirmatory assays, specialists in environmental toxicology, controlled removal from the suspected source. The language was careful because science demands care. Fernando's shoulders loosened for a moment like a man's sloughing armor. He did not celebrate. He had been balancing hope and dread for too long to mistake a preliminary lab note for salvation. But something in him shifted. The machine of his wealth had not found answers, and now, without spectacle, a hidden possibility had been exposed. The dynamic of the household changed not because of a single sentence, but because the sentence authorized a new set of questions. Dr. Ottavio called a meeting. He was deliberate, not cruel. He arranged a small room in the hospital and spoke with the tone of someone reconciling his previous certainty with new data. "We must proceed methodically," he said. "Confirmatory testing, controlled removal from the environment while we pass this properly. We will involve an environmental toxicologist." He did not admit he had been wrong. He did not need to. What mattered was that the hospital now placed its instruments at the problem's disposal. Clarice watched the meeting from the doorway like a woman who had learned to stand in the margins and insist on being visible. She was elated but guarded. Her joy contained a caveat born of experience. Tests could be wrong, interpretations could be slow, vindications could be quiet. She still saw the boys as they played, small and presumptuous of the future. She still saw the blue bottle on the shelf, patient and glinting. There were practicalities to face. If the environmental hypothesis held, someone had to ensure the boys' immediate safety. That meant temporary relocation, detox protocols, hospital stays that might feel like exile to young children who loved their room with posters and toy cars. It meant telling donors and acquaintances that their house might harbor the source of the boys' suffering. It meant confronting the quiet economy of the house, the way certain consumables were chosen more for appearance than safety. It meant examining the ways a home becomes an institution, and the ways institutions ignore the small, ordinary hazards that do not show up in glossy pamphlets. Clarice, who had never sought credit, found herself in the unlikely position of being the axis around which new decisions turned. Fernando took counsel seriously now in a way he had not before. The photograph in Clarice's phone had done the work diplomacy could not. The staff, who had once moved with fixed choreographies, now shifted to follow the new choreography of caution. Donna Elsa, who had maintained the house through revolutions of taste and staff, quietly weighed in with the authority of someone who knew the building's skeleton. And yet not everyone altered course. Friends of Fernando's, people who knew how to make discomfort disappear with service-level invoices and private planes, whispered that the family was being too quick to assume the worst. Dr. Ottavio, in the vulnerable space where professional pride met new data, couched his remarks in probability more than certainty. The house breathed with the nervousness of people rearranging previously immovable things. Clarice kept watching the boys. She kept recording small improvements and declines. She kept asking the right questions, and sometimes the wrong ones. But always the questions were asked. She spent evenings at the window thinking about the name glutaraldehyde and the blue bottle, the way words that live in specialized worlds migrate into kitchens and basements. She wondered how many houses like this one had industrial secrets tucked away, and how often the secret had been mistaken for domestic virtue. Then, a week after the preliminary lab note, something happened in a way that made the house itself lean to listen. It was not dramatic. There was no shouting, no cinematic collapse. The boys were in the nursery, and the morning had crawled in like a pale animal. Miguel woke and did not press his feet to the floor. He reached for the edge of the bed, and his small hands trembled. His breathing quickened in a way that made Clarice's hands move before her mind had labeled the movement. Raphael began to cry, a little panic light in his voice. Clarice lunged forward to steady both of them. She remembered everything she had been taught about keeping a child safe. Move them away from furniture, loosen collars, protect the head. And she did these things not because she was a medical miracle, but because experience teaches the hands what words cannot. Fernando was at the gate that day. He had not been expected to be home. He heard the rising of a sound that did not exist a minute earlier and ran into the room in a way that made the house itself seem to tilt. Donna Elsa came in behind him with a face that had seen 1,000 small tragedies and kept her composure like a well-trained actor. The house reacted like a body called to emergency. Staff moved, phones were dialed, a nurse arrived with a knowing look. That moment, the suddenness of it, was the hinge on which the story would swing. Clarice's notebook, her photograph, the hospital's tentative finding, they all came into focus like instruments being pointed toward a single note. People who had been arguing about probabilities now convened to do practical things. The boys were carried, calmed, wrapped in familiar blankets. The ambulance arrived with the efficient courtesy of trained hands. The hospital took the twins with a professional that tasted of ritual and urgency. Tests were repeated, this time with the laboratory tuned to measure chemicals that did not usually turn up on pediatric panels. When the first real confirmatory note from the lab arrived, it did not march in with trumpets. It came in cold prose, results consistent with exposure measurable above baseline for compounds used in industrial sterilizing agents, a recommendation for a full toxicology panel and environmental assessment. It would require controlled interpretation and follow-up. It would not, in its language, offer redemption. It would, however, give a direction concrete enough to change the actions in the house. Dr. Ottavio read the results. He folded them and looked at Fernando with eyes that had to now carry a different expression, the expression of a man who recognizes that his initial map needs revision. There was no grand apology on his lips. These were professionals, after all, but there was a tightening of duty. "We will do everything properly," he said. "We will isolate variables. We will bring an environmental team. We will proceed under medical supervision, with any removal and with a proper detox plan if it is indicated. We must act within protocols." Fernando exhaled like someone who had been holding his breath underwater. He turned to Clarice, and the gratitude was a plain thing in his face. Not theatrical praise, but an emptiness that had softened because the edge of mystery had been blunted by evidence. He put his good hand on her shoulder and squeezed, as if to press a thank you into someone who had been invisible for too long. Clarice, for her part, did not look for glory. She had wanted answers. She had found a way to ask for tests. She had watched a team swing into action. She had been careful not to claim victory. She had always known the difference between discovery and cure. The confirmation was only the next step. There would be hospitalization, there would be protocols and slow recoveries, and there would be questions about responsibility that would need answering. The house would need to rearrange itself, the staff would need retraining, cabinets would be emptied and shelves rethought. Fernando would have to look at the choices his household had made, the ways convenience and appearances had outpaced safety. That night, the mansion felt oddly smaller. Wealth had not dissolved, the marble remained flawless, but a different power had entered the rooms, a small, stubborn accountability. People who had once measured their lives in the currency of immaculate surfaces now had to account for what lay beneath. The blue bottle in the basement was no longer merely a cleaning product. It had become evidence. The household's habits had become suspect. The family's capacity for self-scrutiny had been awakened. Clarice sat alone for a while after the initial shock had passed. She peeled back the notebook's cover and read the notes she had made in the early days, notes that had once been dismissed as the anxious quirks of a worker who feared for her charges. She smiled with a softness that was not relief. Relief was premature, but with a sense that the world had tilted toward care. She had not believed in miracles. She had believed in observation, and that belief had found purchase. There were, of course, complications. Some friends of Fernando's worried about reputation. Some staff found it hard to accept that the methods they had been taught, ways to achieve a sense of sterility, might be the very thing that harmed. Dr. Ottavio's professional arc would require him to hold both pride and humility in the same hand for the first time in a long while. Clarice herself prepared for long nights and longer fights. She knew the path from discovery to recovery was a long one, and that the house's new humility would be tested more than once. And then, in the middle of these small rearrangements, a new element arrived that no one had calculated: attention. Villagers and neighbors began to whisper. A reporter, sensing a human story, called under the pretense of a routine inquiry. A philanthropist who had known Fernando in other days offered to help with anything required. Families in other parts of the city, reading the faint echo of the case, sent messages about children who had once suffered unexplained symptoms. The matter, once private, began to unfurl into the public sphere. Clarice met these intrusions with the same wary steadiness she brought to everything else. She accepted that awareness could be benevolent and also a kind of pressure. She wanted the boys to get better. She wanted the problem solved and understood so other families would not have to discover the same truth by accident. She also wanted to protect the children's privacy. She had no ambition for public honors. Her suitcase still sat at the foot of her bed. The seams softened by years, and the pages of the notebook tucked beneath a loose strap like a small private ledger of duty. The house had not returned to normal, if a house could ever be normal after a truth had been found beneath its floors, but its rhythms had shifted. The blue bottle of glutaraldehyde no longer sat untouched in the basement. It had been removed under supervision, catalogued, and placed in containment. A forensic environmental team had walked the corridors with instruments that hummed and screens that carried graphs, and for the first time in months, the question of the boy's illness had been answered with a language that could be read in a lab report rather than left to paternal faith or scattered conjecture. But answers do not equal endings. They begin courses. They set in motion mechanics of repair that are slow, sometimes painful, and always awkward. The medical team spoke carefully to the family. Confirmation of exposure did not mean an instant reversal of symptoms. It meant protocols, observation, detoxification where necessary, and above all, time. Hospital doctors explained that the children's bodies had been living under a low chronic pressure for months. Taking away the pressure was an essential step. Supporting the body while it reoriented itself was the rest. Clarice learned these procedures the way she learned everything else, by watching, by asking, by doing. Nurses showed her how to hold a child during a blood draw, so the boy felt less like a patient and more like a small human being whose dignity mattered. A pediatric toxicologist, called in from the city, sat with them and explained in plain terms what the lab had found. Levels of compounds consistent with glutaraldehyde exposure higher than expected for a home environment. The specialist did not lecture. She explained what the tests could mean and what they could not say, the likely symptoms to expect, and the cautious plan to remove the boys from the source and then support them medically. There were moments when Clarice's voice became the pivot of the household's decisions. She argued for simplicity in the boys' immediate environment. No fragrances, only gentle soap. Open windows where weather allowed. She insisted on lists of what cleaners would be used, signed and posted in the laundry room. She stayed in the hospital most nights, sleeping in a chair beside Miguel's bed, when anxiety made him wake and call for the moon page from their storybook. She learned to read the monitors the way she read faces, to find small signals that meant a child's pain was manageable. She never pretended to be more than she was. No medical degrees, no clinical accolades, only a person who had long ago practiced the art of attention and who now practiced it again with a new kind of evidence at her back. The detox phase was the most difficult. It was not cinematic. There were no miraculous chest-thrusting moments. Rather, there were afternoons when Miguel cried more than usual, nights when sleep did not come, moments when appetite was fickle. The medical team warned them that as the body rid itself of accumulated compounds, the children might show transient irritability, headaches, or stomach upset, symptoms to be monitored but not dramatized. There was a watchfulness that resembled grief at times, the family tallying small steps forward and small slips back, measuring a march that did not proceed in neat lines. Once, in the third week of inpatient care, Miguel had a spell of agitation that made Clarice stand with her hand on his chest while a nurse adjusted IV fluids and a doctor checked vitals. It was quick and resolved under observation. The staff handled it with practiced calm. Fernando had rushed in then, the sight of his son in distress, making the million he carried in the outside world seem like something he had misused. He stood by the bed and held Clarice's hand without thinking, the gesture both a thanks and a plea. There was no heroism in Clarice's reaction, only steady care and the habitual small competencies of someone who had always known how to protect a child before calling a person with a title. As days stretched into weeks, the children improved in ways that were patient and stubborn. Miguel's cough thinned, Raphael's color returned in soft, irregular patches. Both boys began to ask for the moon page more often and to sing tunelessly in the bath. They grew playful in the way that recovery allows, cautious then bold. The house, rearranged and airing out, felt like a body taking deep breaths after illness. Workers who had once thought of cleanliness as show now learned that safety could be plain. Bottles of industrial disinfectants were exchanged for products certified safe for domestic use. Staff underwent short trainings led by the environmental team and by Clarice herself, who taught them how to read labels and when to ask questions. Fernando changed in ways more profound than wardrobe or household choices. The man who had once wielded money as a blunt instrument began to use it differently. He invested in an ongoing environmental audit of the house and pledged funds to remediate other residences identified as potential risks by the hospital team. He did not shut down his business or erase his past mistakes with a flourish. He opened his checkbook and his eyes. In conversations with Clarice, late at night in the quiet of the nursery after the boys slept, he confessed the hollow that had lived inside him for months, the helplessness that billions of currency could not fill. Clarice listened, guarded about the admission as she had been about everything that might make her a symbol instead of a person. Their relationship grew on the ground of shared concern and mutual respect, rather than an impulsive romance. He learned to ask for her counsel. She learned to accept his resources when they were offered without the expectation of repayment. Dr. Otavio's arc was quieter and less ceremonious. He did not become a cautionary caricature. He remained a competent physician whose professional judgment had been limited by the kinds of institutional habits all professionals acquire. When the lab's findings arrived, he adjusted his stance, convening a small committee to oversee the environmental assessment and apologizing to the family, not with grand gestures, but with specific actions. He recommended the involvement of a specialist in environmental toxicology and requested the hospital institute a new protocol for cases of unexplained pediatric illness that included careful environmental histories. It was neither a public mea culpa nor a private collapse of pride. It was a professional yield to evidence. The hospital praised him in its internal notes for his leadership in organizing the response. He did not lose his license or his dignity. He lost only a little of the confidence that had once let him close doors too quickly. There was humility there, and in time he would speak at a seminar organized by the new foundation about the need for clinicians to widen the frame when tests come up empty. The decision about who would continue to care for the twins during recovery was not taken lightly. Clarice could have stayed in the house in an official capacity. The family offered her a salaried position with benefits, access to medical classes, and eventual consideration for further education. She accepted not out of hunger for status, but because the arrangement gave her agency. She had always refused to be simply an invisible hand behind the curtains. This position named her work and supported it. Donna Elsa, who had once bristled at Clarice's presence, now met her with an apron and a small conspiratorial smile. The two women had become an unlikely team, one who carried institutional memory and the other who carried a new form of knowledge built from observation, and together they reshaped the household standards. There was a public dimension as well. News of the twins' diagnosis drifted beyond the house. A magazine ran a measured piece about environmental toxins and domestic life. The family requested privacy, and the piece focused on the medical and procedural aspects rather than the personal drama. Messages came from other parents, brief emails, handwritten notes that told of strange cycles of illness that had never been explained. These notes did not make Clarice famous. They made the case feel less accidental. It became clear that the family had been sitting on a problem that was more common than anyone in the household had imagined. Fernando, moved by the letters and by a dawning sense of responsibility, proposed creating a small non-profit to help families with unexplained pediatric illnesses, to fund environmental testing, and to train caregivers and household staff in safe practices. Clarice, cautious as ever, wanted to be sure it would be effective and not merely a PR shield. They spent evenings drawing up the first outline together at the kitchen table. Short-term emergency funds to pay for testing, partnerships with hospitals to refer cases, a small training program for domestic workers in reading labels and reducing exposure, and an on-call team of environmental assessors who could evaluate homes for household toxins. They named it Lumen, after the word for light, and the name felt right. A small light turned on in dark spaces. Launching Lumen required more than money. It required structure and credibility. Fernando used his connections to gather a board that included an environmental toxicologist, a pediatrician with experience in public health, Donna Elsa as a community liaison, and a woman from the city's social services who knew how to make funds actually reach families. Clarice insisted on a clear charter that prioritized families of limited means, arguing that the poorest households were often the least likely to be able to detect or remediate hidden hazards. The board accepted her condition. The former maid who had once polished the toys with the blue bottle found, with Clarice and Donna Elsa, a new vocation leading training sessions for domestic staff, a role she embraced with a seriousness that surprised even herself. There were practical victories and bureaucratic frustrations. Lumen's first case was a family in a small apartment block where a child presented with similar morning deterioration. An environmental team confirmed high levels of cleaning chemicals in the shared laundry room where a restaurant operator had stored industrial supplies. Remediation there required negotiation with landlords, replacement of products, and a modest grant to the family. The child's recovery was gradual but notable. The parents wrote a letter to Lumen that spoke of ordinary gratitude. These small successes built a foundation of trust more durable than any press release. Clarice's life began to look different in other ways too. She accepted small honors offered by local organizations, a plaque from a community health group, a modest stipend to attend a course in child development, and declined larger, more sensational invitations. She insisted that any recognition be tied to the work, not to her image. Fernando remained careful about public exposure. He had learned a lesson in opacity and now preferred quiet amends to loud philanthropy. Their relationship grew on the ordinary rhythms of companionship as much as on the extraordinary ones of crisis. Morning coffee together as the twins made paper boats in the sink, evenings spent reviewing grant applications, long drives to clinics where Clarice gave short talks to staff about labeling and attention. Years, not months, passed before the full measure of change could be read in the family. The twins grew into boys who ran and fought and argued about minor injustices with the energy common to children. Miguel's tendency toward fatigue decreased. Raphael's temperament softened into the everyday mischief of school-aged boys. School reports came in with lines that made Clarice and Fernando both cry silently at separate times. participates well in class, makes friends easily, no notable absences. The house retained its marble and its habits, but now it carried new rituals: open windows in the morning, an organized cleaning cupboard with approved supplies, and a staff who knew that names on labels matter as much as polish on a table. The hospital recognized Lumen with a modest commendation for its partnership in bridging community needs and hospital services. Dr. Ottavio attended the ceremony and, in a short speech that carried the weight of someone reconciling a lesson learned, acknowledged that the profession must remain open to ways of knowing that come from outside conventional training. He thanked Clarice publicly for her insistence, and the applause in the room felt earned rather than staged. The medical community did not leap to a new orthodoxy. It simply folded one more layer of care into its practice. There were personal costs, too. Clarice had to negotiate visibility. She liked the work, but she resented the way attention could sometimes feel like intrusion. Paparazzi did not stalk their house, but there were journalists who wanted a neat arc and a tidy portrait. Clarice declined interviews that she felt would turn her life into a parable. She insisted that the boy's privacy be preserved. Fernando respected her wishes and had long since learned the difference between public good and public spectacle. The marriage that later gave the household a new shape was not the plot of a romance novel. There were no grand declarations beneath a stormy sky. There were dinners shared in the kitchen with mismatched plates, arguments about whether a boy should be allowed to climb the lemon tree, and long conversations about fear and failure. It was, in the end, a choice made by two adults who had walked through a narrow place together and had seen each other's hands steady when it mattered. They married quietly in the garden under the fig tree, where the boys had once rediscovered their laughter, with Donna Elsa wearing an apron altered into a ceremonial sash, with the hospital's pediatrician and the toxicologist as witnesses. The ceremony was small, honest, and surrounded by people who had helped them make a life worth the name. Clarice's identity did not vanish into the title Mrs. She remained an independent force, a co-founder of an organization whose mission she had helped shape. Lumen continued to prioritize training for domestic workers, and the small team grew carefully. They developed a curriculum that taught label reading, basic ventilation practices, and when to ask for professional environmental assessment. They structured an emergency fund to cover testing costs for families with financial need, brokered partnerships with hospitals to create fast-track referrals, and produced leaflets translated into multiple languages used in poorer neighborhoods. The aim was simple: to make sure other families would not wait until a child was gravely ill before someone looked at the bottles on the basement shelf. There were policy ripples too. Though Clarice and Fernando kept their distance from grandstanding, the city's public health office reached out to collaborate on an awareness campaign about the safe use of industrial disinfectants and the importance of professional environmental assessments in unexplained pediatric illness. The campaign was practical and modest: posters in community centers, short training modules for domestic workers, and a hotline staffed by nurses who could advise worried parents to seek medical evaluation. Lumen provided seed money for piloting the program in neighborhoods where small businesses sometimes stored industrial products on premises adjacent to living spaces. Recognition came in many forms: an honorary certificate from a City Health Alliance presented to Clarice for distinguished community service, an invitation to speak at a caregiving conference, and more quietly, notes from the families Lumen had helped. These were the honors that mattered to Clarice, the unsentimental, tangible evidence that the work made a difference. Dr. Ottavio continued to practice, but with a lesson embedded in his methods. He led, at the hospital, a small task force to include environmental histories in pediatric intake questionnaires and to develop a protocol for when to consider toxicology panels. He wrote a paper, academic, careful, in which he described the case with clinical precision and the humility of a clinician who had widened his lens. It was not a renunciation of medical professionalism, it was a refinement. In time, the blue bottle, now securely disposed of and logged in an evidence chart, became a symbol of a quieter lesson, that attention and expertise can come from any corner of a household, that knowledge is not only the domain of diplomas. Clarice's story, kept modest and true, was a story of many small things arranged over months. Relentless observation, an insistence on testing despite polite dismissals, a father's capacity to listen and act, the hospital's willingness to expand its inquiry, and a house that finally admitted its role in the boy's illness. There were trials too. A lawsuit was threatened by a supplier of cleaning products anxious about reputational damage, but it never reached court. Instead, it resulted in an industry conversation about labeling and distribution of industrial disinfectants. Lumen participated in those conversations, not as an accuser, but as a voice for safer choices. Clarice visited factories with environmental engineers and domestic workers to tell plainly what attention had saved in her household. Her voice was steady. She did not seek enemies. Years later, the twins, taller now, teeth exchanging like small flags, rode bicycles in the driveway and fell into arguments about whose turn it was to water the lemon tree. They squabbled with the delightful cruelty only siblings can muster, and then made up with a shared, secret handshake. Fernando watched them sometimes, the way he had watched them in the garden years before, but now his eyes held a quiet contentment, rather than a constant, raw dread. He and Clarice had built a life together that did not erase the past, but made room for a different future. They were partners in more than marriage, partners in a mission. At a small ceremony the city held to recognize community health champions, Clarice stood on a modest stage with an enamel cup of coffee in her hand. She accepted an award on behalf of Lumen, and in her speech she did not speak of miracles or of singular heroism. She spoke of watching. She spoke of the quiet power of noticing what others overlook. She reminded the room, professionals, domestic workers, parents, that the simplest acts of care can change trajectories. Open a window, read a label, ask a question. Her words were short and clear. She thanked the nurses, the environmental team, Fernando, Donna Elsa, and the two boys who had been patient more bravely than any adult could manage. The epilogue of their story was not the tidy sweep of a film's final frame. It was a series of modest headlines and cumulative changes. Lumen's grants helped dozens of families. The hospital integrated environmental assessments into evaluation protocols for pediatric cases. Domestic worker unions began offering short courses recommended by Lumen. A network of neighborhood health volunteers had formed, many of them women who had once cleaned houses or cared for children and who now taught others to read labels and to speak up when something felt off. Clarice's suitcase remained in the back of a closet, but the notebook it housed had a new place on a shelf in Lumen's small office. Its pages copied and digitally archived so other caregivers could learn the art of observation. A photograph of the boys, taken on a rainy afternoon when they were 11 and muddy and laughing, sat near it. The Foundation's first annual report bore the names of dozens of families whose lives had changed in small and meaningful ways because someone had finally asked the right question. If there is a moral to this story, it is not that money is useless, nor that only the uncredentialed can see what matters. It is that attention, patient, repeated, brave, can redirect even the most costly and convoluted efforts toward a true solution. The millionaire had spent fortunes and learned humility. The nanny had spent decades practicing the craft of care and learned how to turn observation into evidence. Together they built something that kept other children from falling into the same silence. On quiet nights, Clarice still read the moon page to the boys, now taller and more opinionated about which page deserved the repeated line. She would watch their small, absurd rituals with a tenderness that had not softened her seriousness. She still recorded small things in a new notebook, notes on training sessions, ideas for workshops, names of families to call. Her life had changed in ways she had never planned for, but she had not given up the fundamental habit that had always been hers, to notice. If this story moved you, share it or leave a comment below. You never know whose attention might make a life safer.